welcome to Found in Translation, a weekly-ish exploration of one fellow's translation of the Christian scriptures, one chapter or two at a time. I'm Brandon Rhodes, and across the internet from me is the translator himself, Brandon Johnson. Hi, Brandon.
Hey, Brandon.
And our guest co-host today is Elle Dowd, with pronouns she, they, a bi-furious pastor who preaches, writes, and teaches about God's desire to liberate us from the things we use to oppress each other: cis-heterosexism, racism, ableism, queerphobia, colonialism, misogyny, childism, capitalism, and white supremacy. She believes we must deconstruct the harmful systems infecting the Christian church and other American institutions. Yes. That a queer femme interpretation is at the center of grace. Love it. And all bodies, including yours, are beautifully and wonderfully made. They're also the author of Baptized in Tear Gas, From White Moderate to Abolitionist. What a title. With Broadleaf Books. Elle, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, and especially for these chapters, this is going to be a fun time.
Yeah.
I want to ask you just a couple questions to help out folks get to know you. First, what are you scheming on these days? What's got your heart and mind abuzz?
Yeah, so right now I'm a full-time PhD student at the Chicago Theological Seminary. And so I'm very much like in the midst of all of that. I just finished up my comprehensive exam. So for people who don't necessarily know what that is, and also different institutions do it differently, there's kind of like 4 different areas that I am tested over, like my expertise. And each area has a bibliography of 20 plus books, some articles that you're supposed to like read and be super familiar with. And then they like lock you in a room for 6 hours with no notes. And they give you like 1 or maybe 2 questions. And they're like, answer this question. And that's for 1 exam. So you do that 4 times. So it was very intense, right? Like when I first heard about this, I'm like, how in the world am I going to write for 6 hours? Like what, like, even if I know all this stuff, like there's not that much to say, but I was wrong. There definitely is that much to say. So, my 4 exam areas were Latin American liberation theology, Marcella Althouse Reed, trauma and trauma theology, and queer hermeneutics and theology. So, there's just like a lot there, but I just passed those exams, which is like, means I'm all but dissertation, which is like a big milestone. So now I'm doing some research for my dissertation, which is about bisexuality, bisexual theology. So I'm very like much immersed in that space right now. There's a lot of like Marxist flavor and conversation to that theology because of the connection to bisexual theologian Marcella Althouse Reed and liberation theologians. So that's kind of like where my energy, like when I'm in the shower washing my hair, like that's what I'm thinking about is bisexual theology and Marcella Althouse Reed.
Oh, that's fantastic.
If you ever like ask PhD students like what they're studying, like we get like our pupils dilate and we get like weird because it's like, the nichest, like weirdest thing. So, I try to like keep under control, give the elevator pitch, but that's, yeah.
Yep.
I'm here for that energy though. It's
yeah,
I get excited
absolutely.
with you. Yeah.
Just let it go.
Yeah.
All right, I want to hear what your relationship with the Bible has been like.
Yeah, I grew up in an ELCA church, but it was a very conservative ELCA church. ELCA churches are like, they just like run the gamut in what worship looks like, what theology looks like. And I grew up in a suburb of Des Moines, Iowa. So the way that I was taught to view the Bible was like a very like conservative evangelical kind of point of view. Like, I don't know, there was like focus on the family books around the congregation, that kind of thing. So I always sort of knew there was something in me that like I didn't have language for, that sort of like knew that this didn't feel right. Like I felt like I know God, or like at least the important things about God, like about God cares about love, God cares about liberation. And it just didn't seem resonant with the way that I was taught to read the Bible growing up. And so I had like definitely inner conflict about that. And then I went to college and I took Bible classes from Dr. Hector Avalos, who studied under F.M. Cross at Harvard. And he was an atheist and a Bible scholar, which is like, actually like weirdly very common. They like joke that if you go to Harvard, you like have to be an atheist to like by the time you get out. But so I was in this class with Dr. Hector Avalos as my professor, and he was kind of infamous on campus because he was just really intense. And like the first day he'd show up in like a suit and sunglasses and then recite the like roll call from memory, because he had like also memorized most of the Bible. And so he was kind of like, I don't know, intimidating us or something. Yeah.
That is intimidating.
Yeah. And so he was like infamous on campus. Also, especially because like anyone with a more like evangelical point of view was like, oh, he's out there to like break your faith. He's out there to lead you astray, right? He's this like atheist Bible professor. But that wasn't my experience at all. He actually really affirmed my faith in many ways because he taught me that there's many different ways to read the Bible, that we all come to the Bible with a lens. And even more importantly, he taught me that like these things, these questions I had, these things that I felt inside me were true, were actually part of like a longer, larger conversation of biblical scholarship. And like these like ways of reading the Bible were like theories with names like made by people. And it was like a whole conversation that I could enter into. And so for me, it was like, some people went into Dr. Avalos's class and had like a crisis of faith or did some major deconstruction. And, I definitely like experienced some of that. But for me, it was actually more like, wow, I knew this couldn't be the only way that we read this. I knew this didn't have to be our relationship. And so I've always loved the Bible. I, like growing up, this is like, I definitely had some like undiagnosed neurodivergence. Okay. But growing up, I, would like rush to finish my schoolwork. And then I would like read the Bible, and I had this like purple notebook that I would like write all these things. This is me in like 5th grade. Okay. Like in 5th grade, I was like tracing the genealogies, like, oh, the one in like First Kings is different than in, Chronicles. Like, what's going on here? I was like really into it, like weird. And like leading my first Bible study at like age 10. So I've always loved the Bible, but it's clearly a problematic fave, right? Like there's a lot of bad stuff that has been done with the Bible, a lot of harmful things. So part of my passion is that like I sort of don't want to relinquish this thing that I love so much to people who use it to hurt other people. And so I think sometimes in mainline or even progressive spaces, we've sort of been like, we don't want to be like evangelicals, so we're not going to push memorization, or we don't want to be like evangelicals, so we're like going to, I don't know, maybe not hold the Bible in high regard, or like we don't talk about it in a certain way. And I really feel the opposite, that like the more that we're familiar with scripture, the more that we can uncover its liberatory, potential, and that we can talk back to scripture and have relationship with scripture and struggle and like create beautiful things and join the conversation. So yeah, there's still plenty of verses that I read and I'm like, ew, why is this in here? But I've since learned to kind of reclaim, reframe, or even like reject certain parts, and that has been really important for my faith journey.
That's great.
Yeah, so much of that story sounds familiar. And you mentioned in your PhD stuff that you've been working on studying trauma and all that kind of stuff. And I'm a therapist by day, focusing on trauma treatment. And so, bringing a trauma-informed lens to translation, but reading and using scripture is a big part of focus too. And so it sounds like that might be up your wheelhouse.
Yeah, definitely. Part of, so again, I'm doing bisexual theology, and bisexual women in particular have really disproportionately high rates of trauma, like similar to that of combat veterans. And it's because, similar, like you would think, I don't know what you would think. Some people would think like, oh, maybe like lesbian women or gay men would have like similar numbers, but what we actually see for bisexual women is that our trauma numbers in a variety of ways, and sort of like types of trauma, poverty, abuse, intimate partner violence, whatever, our numbers are higher both than monosexual gay men and lesbians, and then obviously also higher than our straight counterparts. So for me to do a theology around bisexuality, it felt really important to have some familiarity with trauma and trauma theology and trauma-informed theology. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, your article about memorizing scripture of progressive case was so assuring, and like I felt so connected in reading that. Just
Yeah.
the sense of, yeah, like the bastards can't have this book. It does have some messed up stuff, but that's part of the point, is that the blessing comes in the wrestling, as they say, like
Right.
there's a lot of liberation in this thing, that we can't just like give up on this library of liberation because people grab it from the wrong end.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
So we are going to be talking this week about Matthew chapters 14 and 15. As with all episodes of the season, we are doing that with a particular focus on reading it from a context of authoritarianism in America, as a text against authoritarianism, written under imperial occupation. If you haven't had a chance to read Brandon's translation, for those watching, we're going to have it up on the screen here in a sec. And for those of you listening, we highly encourage you to hit pause, tap on the link, and give it a read at litbible.net. And always don't sleep on the footnotes. There's a lot of great nerdery in there, especially, holy shitballs, in these chapters. There's a lot of good stuff. So we'll see you when you're done reading. All right, let's start off with Matthew 14 here. There's this story about Herod being a punk. A very literal story of authoritarianism. Brandon,
Sure.
would you... punk is the nice word for it.
Yeah.
Would you give it a read for us?
I mean, and it might be rude to punks out there, but
Yeah, indeed.
yeah.
Being a dick. How about that?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Immerser. He was woken from among the dead, and that's why powers are at work in him." You see, Herod had arrested John, bound him, and put him away in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. John had told him continually, "For you to have her is not right." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered him to be a prophet. At Herod's birthday feast, Herodias' daughter danced among them and pleased Herod, which prompted him to agree by oath to give her whatever she requested. Having been urged by her mother to do so, she said, "Give me, here on this platter, the head of John the Immerser." Although the king was distressed, he ordered it to be given because of his oath and the guests. By sending the order, he beheaded John in the prison. John's head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. John's students came and carried his body away, buried him, and went to bring the news to Jesus. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Yeah. Or something.
Yeah,
Or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I have always really been interested in the story of John the Baptist. I think because I'm really interested in the people that had an influence on Jesus. And Matthew tells the story of John the Baptist sort of out of order, narratively. You have to kind of he's talking about the arrest, which happened much earlier on, and then now is talking about John's execution. But the story of John the Baptist and Jesus is so intertwined from conception, even really from in utero, when they first recognize each other with Mary's visitation to Elizabeth. So I think doing community organizing, knowing organizers, these relationships to me are super fascinating. Backing up to the arrest, which is mentioned in this passage, Jesus was baptized by John the Immerser and then went out into the wilderness. And it's during that time that this arrest happens. We find out like later when Jesus comes back that arrest has happened. And that's when Jesus starts his public ministry. So to me, it's like John's story is a radicalizing moment for Jesus, like this person that he grew up with who sort of like initiated him into this movement via the baptism. Like he goes off and has this like, I don't know, wild experience in the desert and comes back. Like it's all these identity moments, right? Like baptism, identity moment, going off into the desert and really struggling with faith and wrestling, and then comes back and it's like, oh, my sort of like mentor, my friend, my cousin, like he was just arrested. And so Jesus's response is like, he begins his public ministry, like, let's go. And so this story too, it just seems like, you know, in Matthew's like a lot of like drama and tension, and this story, it's really starting to ramp up that sense of tension between Jesus's ministry and like authoritarianism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think these two chapters, this one and 15, are kind of the pivot of the whole book. And I think this is it. Like this death of John the Baptist is what propels. It's like Jesus 2.0 into the next phase.
Yeah,
even like 3.0, because it's then like right after this, the next verse is like Jesus like goes away and has to have some quiet like space to process this.
Yeah.
Really a sense of counting the cost and realizing, okay, yep, that is where this goes. That's where this leads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he has to make like a decision, right? He's basically seeing in some ways his future play out in front of him, and not for, you know, not even the first time. Like growing up around this time, there were uprisings that were put down. So Jesus was familiar with like what happens to people who speak out against the empire, what happens to people who speak out against power. But this just hits so close to home for him. So he's basically like being like, okay, this is the road that I'm on. Do I continue? Do I march right towards this danger for the sake of love and liberation? Or do I back off or try to keep a low profile, or I don't know, try to appease or do something else? And he makes the decision to keep going. I think too, these texts are really powerful from like a sort of like Christ the King point of view in really contrasting the kind of leader that Herod is with the kind of leader that Jesus is. Like Herod sold out his people for power, security, safety with the Roman Empire. Jesus is like on the side of the people, one of the people. Herod hosts this banquet in which like the platter is death and violence, and then Jesus is going to go on to host his own banquet. We'll read later with the feeding of the 5,000, and it's just like Jesus is about, you know, generativity and abundance and enough and caring for people's bodies, whereas like Herod's banquet is all about power, control, violence, death, fear.
Mm-hmm. I love that way of contrasting the two stories. Like, don't just read this in isolation. Hear it. These all are kind of echoing around each other.
Yeah, they're next to each other on purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. When I read this passage, I always think of like those, like all the Jesus story movies that were made in like the 60s, where Jesus is this very like statuesque, stoic figure. And then they have Herod like as if John is like his best friend, and he's like so conflicted about, man, I wish I didn't have to kill you, but I promised and I'm so sorry. Like, and it's like, that's not what's happening here. He's worried about an uprising if he does this. And that's why he's distressed. And Jesus is the one who actually has feelings about it and has to go off and take care of himself in the next scene here.
I appreciate Matthew's voice in this. I was rereading it this week, feeling like, oh man, is there an energy in telling this story where it's kind of blaming Herodias and her daughter for it and putting the blood on their hands? And then Matthew's like, no, let's just be clear. Let's like nip this in the bud. Any gossip about it being them, not Herod, because I can imagine Herod trying to diffuse culpability in this murder. Yeah. And then Matthew's like, in saying this, he's the one who did it.
Right.
That's like, let's not be cute about this.
Yeah.
Right.
Misogynistic.
By sending the order, he beheaded John in the prison.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. That also reminds me, thinking about like from an authoritarian perspective, like anti-authoritarian perspective, it reminds me of like Timothy Snyder wrote this book on tyranny. I don't know if you've read it, but it's like a very digestible way to learn about and practice resistance to authoritarianism, tyranny. And one of the things that he talks about is how authoritarianism is a machine and there's all these cogs in the machine. And so sometimes resistance looks like these big moments where you're like, I don't know, like Jesus takes these big moments of confrontation, right, with the powers that be, but also a lot of really important, tiny little micro moments of resistance are also what sort of gums up the gears and can slow down the violence of authoritarianism. So thinking about that verse that's like, by sending the order, he beheaded John in the prison. It's like there was probably like a chain of people who were involved here. Like Herod didn't probably go down to the prison and do this himself. It was by sending the order. And so any number of people could have resisted there or slowed things down, right? And so I think about that, like in our own context, the ways that emails get buried at the bottom of your inbox, or a form gets lost, or the ink runs out, right? If you're ordered to like print some propaganda or something, all of these little things that we can do to just slow things down, gum things up. We don't have to just follow orders. And there is another choice besides sort of like radically saying no in a big way that like then you're just killed or disposed of, and then like the next person fills that role. There's actually like a really important role that many of us can play in slowing things down through like malicious incompetence, even,
Sacred bumbling.
Or just like,
yes,
like really minute perfectionism of like, no, I have to follow the protocol. I'm following the rules, like step by step, right? Like, just,
yes, yeah. exactly. Committee it to death, right?
Oh man,
yeah.
So there was a book that was distributed throughout Europe, I believe, during World War II, that you can still buy from. It was published by the U.S., whatever preceded the CIA. It's Simple Sabotage Field Manual. And it was basically telling Europeans, like, here's how to kind of gum shit up. Like, it's as direct and literal of that as, like, putting sand in the gears. And as much as just drag your feet so hard.
Yeah.
And, like, slow roll it all.
Yeah. And it's also, like, it's interesting, too, like some of the methods of like counterintelligence programs that were used by the FBI against like radical activists in like the 60s and 70s. I'm like so aware of the way that we sometimes do the job of like the feds for them. Like there's all of this, stuff about like one of the ways to break up liberation movements is to create infighting. And I'm not saying like everyone in the movement who, starts an argument is an op, but like low key, sometimes we're doing the job of authoritarians for them by not turning down on each other, turning up on the state, keeping like the main thing, our focus in resistance.
Yeah, the left is a circular firing squad is a tragically true trope sometimes. Like, yeah. Well, let's keep going on this story here. After Jesus kind of has a spiritual processing of it all, the loss of his cousin, There's some feeding. Would you read these next few verses, Brandon?
Yeah, this is him going off to grieve for a little bit in the first couple verses here. When Jesus heard, he withdrew from there in a boat to somewhere private. After the people heard about it, they left their towns and followed him on foot. As he disembarked, he saw the large crowd, and he was deeply moved with compassion for them, and healed those of them who were sick. When evening arrived, his students came to him and said, "This place is remote, and the time is already late. Send the people away so they can get to the villages to buy food for themselves." But he replied, "They don't need to leave. You give them something to eat." His students responded, "We don't have anything here except 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." So he said, "Bring them here to me." And he directed the crowds to recline on the grass. He took the 5 loaves of bread and the 2 fish, and looked up to the heavens. He spoke praise, and after breaking them, he gave the loaves of bread to his students, and the students gave them to the crowds. Everyone ate and was satisfied, and they picked up 12 full baskets of leftover pieces. 5,000 men had eaten, plus women and children. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to
Thanks
God.
be to God. This story is like actually really formational for me growing up because I heard like a really rad sermon about it as like I don't know, I was probably like in 3rd grade or something, and it stuck with me. But it was a pastor who was preaching basically like a sort of demythologization kind of angle on this story, and was like, did Jesus physically miraculously multiply the bread and fish, or is it the case that actually most people had food with them but not everyone, and Jesus's words and compassion caused people to open up their hearts and sort of like share the food with one another, and when everyone shared there wasn't more than enough? And I remember hearing this story or that sermon as a kid and being like, well, that kind of takes the magic out of that story. Like, what do you mean Jesus didn't sort of like hocus pocus all this bread? But as I got older and maybe you'd say more cynical, I was like, I actually think in many instances it would be more of a miracle to get people to share freely with one another than it would be to like poof, like magic extra bread and fish. So that story has like stuck with me as like a major like sermon that like changed my life.
Yeah, that's
I love
unfortunately
that.
all too true. That yeah.
I wish I could have heard that in like 3rd or 5th grade. Like
Yeah.
I didn't hear that angle until I was like 40.
Yeah.
And I can't stop reading all of these stories through a similar lens. Like there's a double miracle of like, okay, the kind of surface reading is, wow, Jesus broke the second law of thermodynamics. Cool. Kind of nice magic trick, made sure everybody get fed. There's cool things you can mine from that, but also that like it feels impossible to break through a scarcity mindset, break through exclusion energies in a culture or a community. It feels so hard and impossible to break the fixation on a punitive carceral cop mindset, to get the cop out of our heads. Stories of Jesus being able to get the cop out of people's heads or get the stinginess out of people's heads, holy shitballs, that feels miraculous, especially in times where we've had 10 years with this bully on the East Coast having power, and it feels impossible to break people out of the cult. So stories of Jesus breaking people out of their own little micro cults feels like, okay, that's a hope that feels like a stretch for me.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's also like, you know, one of those moments where like it does in some ways feel like something that we can do to emulate Jesus. Like if we're reading this as like this mutual aid moment, it doesn't feel so impossible to apply to our own lives, right? To be like, oh, well, maybe I can't like magic poof bread into existence, but I wonder if there's people in my neighborhood that are going hungry, and that there's other people in my neighborhood that have a little bit extra, and maybe we could build relationships and get organized enough that we could make sure that everybody has what they need instead of like wasting the abundance that we've been blessed with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, either way, this is a story about abundance and generosity and community, but I that makes total sense to me, that it makes it way more accessible to, so what do we do with this if we're coming at it from that angle?
Yeah.
How do we
Yeah.
emulate it?
Yeah. Theology wise, a lot of times, so in like the ELCA Lutheran understanding, there's 2 or maybe 3 sacraments. It's controversial. Baptism, Holy Communion, maybe confession and forgiveness. Depends on who you ask. And, you know, different traditions like sort of think about sacraments in different ways. But one of the formulations for a sacrament is that there's like a physical element and a command. And so Jesus says to the students, you give them something to eat, which sounds like a command to me. And then all of this like food, which would be like a physical element. So it's really like a sacramental moment to feed one another and to, or if you know, more broadly, this mutual aid way of living, this way of sharing with one another is sacramental.
I was gonna say, yeah, that command piece there really clicks it into place of the way we're talking about it here, of it being about the mutual aid angle. There is nothing here that says that it like magically multiplied on its own. Like, there's some merit there that it doesn't take away from what it says. It just takes away from tradition, maybe, but adds something maybe better in its place. So.
And I'm like down to keep the magic angle too. Like if it was like magic, like that's also cool. Like you know, and there's plenty of like tradition, people over the world who view the world, their worldview includes like things like this on the daily, right? So I'm okay with that as well. But for me to like apply to my own life, my magic's a little rusty, so I like this idea.
Yes. Fair. I think that's fair. Yeah. Yeah, I think you were mentioning the linguistic thing in here, which is just kind of a small thing. Here, it gets more significant in chapter 26, but here and in the next chapter, where it's the feeding of the 4,000, it's a slightly different word for what he does when he breaks the bread. So here it's spoke praise. In the next chapter, it's gives thanks. And then at the Last Supper, where he breaks the bread and blesses the wine, he does each of them. And then says, pour it out lavishly for many. And it's this sort of sense of connecting the abundance of the Last Supper, of that confessional meal, with these 2 events, pulling it together.
So after this feeding of the 5,000, there's a pretty good story about Jesus and Peter and a boat. Never thought they'd be
Where there
off
might
the
be
boat.
some magic element.
And there might be some magic
that's
element
hard
there
to remove.
too. Yeah. And then they get back on dry land, and in Matthew 15, it starts like this.
Then Pharisees and Bible scholars from Jerusalem came to Jesus and said, "Why do your students sidestep the traditions of the elders? They're not washing their hands whenever they eat." So he responded, "And why do you sidestep God's directions with your traditions? You see, God said, 'Value your father and your mother,' and 'Whoever speaks harmfully against their father or mother, they should certainly die.' Instead, you put forward that whoever tells their father or mother, 'Whatever support you might have received from me, I gave away as an offering,' won't need to value their parent. You negated God's message with your tradition. Fakers! Isaiah prophesied rightly about you. This people value me with their lips, but their heart stays distant from me. They fruitlessly claim reverence for me while teaching human instruction as God's direction." Then Jesus called the crowd's attention and said, "Listen and make sense of this. What goes in someone's mouth doesn't make them ordinary. Rather, what comes out of their mouth is what makes a person ordinary." Then his students went up to him and asked, "Do you know that the Pharisees were provoked by your message?" "Every plant that wasn't planted by my divine Father will be pulled out," he answered. "Ignore them. The guides are blind. If a blind person guides a blind person, both will fall in a ditch." Peter responded, "Explain this parable to us." "You still don't understand?" Jesus responded. "Have you considered how everything that goes into the mouth proceeds to the belly and is expelled into a toilet? But what emerges from the mouth comes from the heart, and these make the person unclean. since harmful ruminations, murder, marital infidelity, sexual exploitation, theft, making false reports about someone, and contemptuous speech all come from the heart. These are what make someone unclean. Eating without washing their hands doesn't make someone unclean. The word of the Lord.
Speak to God.
So this was a pivot point for you, huh?
Yeah, this last paragraph in particular has shaped how I read whenever it talks about clean and unclean or sacred and ordinary throughout the New Testament. It's I'm going to take Jesus' word for it that it's never talking, not Paul, not Jesus, about like you are bad because you ate shellfish, or are not Jewish, or are a woman on your period, or whatever, fill in the blank, right? But it's how you treat people, how you talk about people, what you do to others that makes it so that you are clean or unclean, which really fits with stuff that we've talked about, like when we did our season on Hebrews, where being clean, pure, it has to do with the sense of being anointed for a particular sacred calling. And so it's basically saying like these things don't fit with your calling to represent the character of God, to do God's work of including everybody, liberating everybody. And so you're removing your anointing when you do those things.
There's such a power that authoritarianism and just power relies on in shaming and othering. Like that's part of how it controls us. And yeah, growing up in the evangelical world with Bible translations that don't always catch these nuances, and preachers and theologians who don't either, it's like they're giving a foothold to dominators in the text, to shame and the power that shame and body shame can have, like, and putting it on the lips of Jesus. I really appreciate this distinction. It takes away one of their favorite sticks to swing at people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the clearest examples that comes to mind in the verses 8 and 9 here, especially they fruitlessly claim reverence for me while teaching human instruction as God's direction, makes me immediately think of condemnation of queer folks, and it's just not what the Bible says. It's not what God is teaching, but they claim it as God's direction and hit people over the head with it, literally murder people, and say it's in the name of Christ.
Yeah,
it's similar to that. This translation shift that you've made around like sinners to deviators or people who deviate, and just catching this pattern that like sinner language, deviator language in that time primarily was a cultic conformity word that became a slur, this catch-all for othering people. It's not everybody who doesn't live up to God's standard, or at least that's not reading it contextually. It's much more the sense of like you're eating and drinking with those gross people.
Yeah, I think in our context it fits with what's happening now with immigrants. It's the sense of they're not conforming to XYZ that we think they should be, whether that's coming in through the proper channels or maybe preferences that they just stay somewhere else anyway. And because they're not doing what we want, we distrust and claim that they're all criminals. And even if they're not, like the fact that they're here means that they're just more likely to do something, like all the sense of because these people are going against our norms, something bad is going to happen. And I think that's what's happening in this context here with Jesus, is that they still remember Babylon. right? And so they're like, we're going to hold all these rules so that that doesn't happen again. And we're going to be really, really militant about naming who are the people that might be causing us to move closer to that again. And it's them, of course. It's all those people.
Yeah.
And do what we need to do to crush that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, like, thinking again about how we noticed, like, the story of the execution of John the Baptist is right up against this story of the feeding of the 5,000. This story about sort of like who is part of our in group, who is part of that, who is left out, like who does God's love and grace and community extend to, and who is outside of that line, is right up against this story with the Canaanite woman. And Jesus has to like grapple with that for himself of like who's part of the in group and who's not. And this decision by Jesus to say, you know, it's the things that come from people's hearts that make them ordinary is the sort of thing that paves the way later for Gentiles to be included under God's grace and as part of the church. And you see, like, you know, with this next story, with the story of the Canaanite woman, a similar sort of question of like, who is Jesus for? Who is God's love for? Who's God's liberation for? Who's part of the in group? Who's part of the out group? Who gets to draw that line? Who gets to decide? It's like just really the placement of these stories makes them again feel related to me.
Yeah. Let's stroll right into that story, Brandon. Could you tell us the story of the Canaanite woman?
Okay. After leaving that place, Jesus went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Surprisingly, a Canaanite woman from that land came outside and cried out, pleading, "Lord, Son of David, have compassion for me. My daughter is tormented by demons." However, Jesus didn't respond a word to her. His students went up to him and asked him, "Tell her to go away because she's following and calling to us." In response, Jesus said, "I was only sent to the house of Israel's forsaken sheep." Then she approached and bowed down to him. She pleaded, "Lord, help me." Jesus responded, "It's not appropriate to take the children's food and toss it to the family pets." "Yes, sir," she replied. "In fact, that's because the pets eat the scraps that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Madam, your trust is impressive. May what you hope for happen." And her daughter was restored from that moment on.
I know in the footnotes there's been like some really good work that you've done, Brandon, in sort of like placing some of the elements of this story in its cultural context so that it's like less yikes, but there's still some parts of it that feel pretty yikes, you know?
Yes.
Like, I'm like picturing, you know, like picturing the story where it's like this woman is like crying and like asking for help, and Jesus like ignores her at first, is like, okay. You know, and then the disciples or the students saying, hey, would you please get her to shut the fuck up? She's really annoying us, you know, like there's just like, you know, eventually Jesus shows some compassion, some learning, but like it's hard to see that. And it reminds me it reminds me of my friend who another friend of mine who's a community organizer said that community organizing is annoying people but strategically. And that's like what I see here is like she doesn't give up. She's like got that, you know, passion of like a mother worried about her child, and she is like following him, making noise, not being smaller, not giving up. Like she's continuing to take space even when Jesus is kind of like, yeah, I'm not for you actually. She keeps pressing, keeps going. And so she basically, I mean, there's multiple stories in the Bible where someone basically annoys someone else into doing the right thing, and this time it's Jesus who kind of gets annoyed and then maybe impressed into doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I don't really know how to answer that part of it. Like, I have some insights, I think, into some of the specifics of what's said, but why he doesn't respond well at first is, I don't know. Maybe he's just still tired and grieving from John,
Yeah.
and then having to have compassion and feed a giant group of people, and he's like, that's not what I'm doing right now. I'm just trying to get through town on my way somewhere else. This is not what I was planning on for my day. And she annoys him into, he's like, okay, all right, nope, you're right, it's fine, I can do this. And
Does the
Yeah.
Lord need a
it
nap?
stops.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Right.
so. He was grumpy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I love this story too. Marcella Althaus Reed, that bisexual theologian I mentioned earlier, talks about this story and some other stories as part of Jesus's becoming, which is like a kind of process
Mhm.
theology that says like all of us, including God, are in a process of becoming. And Marcella Althaus Reed talks about the way that Jesus became Jesus Christ through his interactions and relationships with women. So, Jesus was knit together in the uterus of a woman and breastfed by a woman and raised by a woman. And then throughout his ministry, we see these interactions with women as being really important turning points for Jesus's ministry. And so Jesus becomes who he is because of women. And so for Althaus Reed, that she also says then that the way that she as a woman speaks back to the body of Christ on earth now as the church is a way of continuing in that tradition of sort of like pushing back, agitating the body of Christ into becoming all it can be. It's just like cool to think again, like the people who influenced Jesus, like Jesus was raised by this like revolutionary mom who like sang this protest song about tyrants being torn down. Like Jesus was mentored and had John the Baptist like leading the way, making the way for him. And then even these interactions with like a stranger, like in this story, Jesus has really impacted. Jesus didn't sort of come, I don't know, fully assembled. Like Jesus was formed over time by these relationships, as we all are.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's making decisions in real time. Like he doesn't have his itinerary for his whole like years of doing the work planned in
Yeah.
advance. Like he's like, okay, how do I get through my day today? Just like all of us.
Yeah. I love that insight of like the people who propel him forward and awaken him are all women. Um, the stone the builder rejected, the people the patriarchy silenced has become the cornerstone of
Hmm.
Christ's Christ consciousness, including a Canaanite woman, someone who's also trespassing in ethnic chasm as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels here in my mind with like the Samaritan woman at the well, and that kind of persistence
Mm,
and yeah, being the woman in a patriarchal society as well as a non-Jewish person, talking to
Yeah.
Jesus as the more dominant between those two, not Roman certainly.
Right.
now, this has one of the most important um, translation shifts, I think, in everything you've done. Uh,
Potentially.
yeah, it shifts something quite pleasantly to me, anyway. Can you narrow us in
Yeah.
on that?
Yeah, the big one is verse 27. The change from dogs to family pets is not, I'm not the first one by any means who has noticed that. That's a different word than like street dogs. It's like puppies or family pets. And even the word for like street dogs, feral dogs was not a culturally used slur the way it is in our culture.
Mm.
So it's really just this image. But the big change in 27 is what I have is, in fact, that's because, and there are a couple of the more widely used versions that do something like this. The CSB, the Christian Standard Bible, and the New American Bible Revised Edition both have something that reflect this a little bit. But the most widely ones all have some form of like negation. It's like, yes, but maybe give me some scraps anyway, please, is kind of the impact of how they word it. And that is not what it's saying. If it is what it's saying, it's the only place in all of Greek literature where the words are used that way, which makes me doubt it. So there's after an affirmative. So after the yes, sir, it's kai gar, or the words in Greek. And kai can be used a lot of different ways, and or this emphatic. So sometimes even, or specifically, or in fact, indeed. Just this even, like agreeing and saying even more, and then gar is always causative. It doesn't do anything else. That's because the pets eat the scraps that fall from them. Meaning, following this feeding of the 5,000 that we just read, there's enough. There's enough to go around. Like, feeding the family's pets doesn't take away from the family's children. There's enough for everybody. And she gets that. She gets the abundance. She already understands his message in a way that the students, the disciples, are still struggling to come to grips with, but she already gets it. And he sees that, and that's why he's impressed, right? Like, you get this already. Okay, let's do this.
Thanks for the reminder. Let's go.
You're reminding me. Yeah, okay, you're right. Yeah. And there will be enough. I will have enough energy, even though I'm grieving, even though I'm tired. Mm-hmm. Helping you is not going to take anything away, ultimately.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that is the point of this story. And it really is paired with the beginning of this chapter, with the clean and unclean, what goes in, what comes out, and the inclusion and abundance that is there. It's fitting that format that Matthew has over and over and over, where Jesus does some teaching and then exemplifies it, does some more teaching and then exemplifies that. So Sermon on the Mount, and then chapters 8 and 9 being more of what he was talking about there. Same thing here. Part of what makes this so pivotal for me is not just that it changes the meaning of the story, which it does, and that's amazing. But I think that discussion about what's clean and unclean and this story about the Canaanite woman are the central, it's the pivotal section of the entire book. That clarifies the theme of the entire book, has this chiastic structure, which I could bring it up, but chiasms in Bible are Jewish literary structure where it has like parallels at the beginning and the end, and then the further you go in, the second section is the parallel to the second to last section, and so on until you get to the one in the very center, and this is it. This is the one in the center. And so like the second to center is the 5,000 and the 4,000, and then there's this. And so this sense of there are no boundaries of who's allowed to be in and who's allowed to be out. It's a completely, radically, a universally inclusive message. There's abundance. There's enough for everybody. You don't need to keep anybody out in order to have enough for those who are already in. Like, that is the message of the entire book of Matthew.
And the fact that Matthew is seen as this, it emphasizes Jesus as the new Moses. There's a lot of Deuteronomy kind of energy in Matthew compared to the other three Gospels, that he's speaking in that, he's storytelling in that dialect, and the punchline, of course there's a chiastic structure if he's pulling all that, and that it lands as this, of this like the lavish, abundant hesed, fidelity of Yahweh to Israel is not a zero-sum game. It overflows. There's more than. And the Canaanite woman being like, yo, remember that part? It's not zero-sum. Within this context of like a Moses-y Deuteronomy kind of vibe, I love it. Sweet and sour in a good cocktail. It just like blends and balances so nicely.
Yeah.
And then as we're talking about how Jesus kind of reminds her, or no, other way around, which is important. She reminds Jesus about what this is all about, this abundance and this inclusion. that he is all about. It then leads into another story of him getting a bunch of mutual aid to happen between people, feeding 4,000 plus people. The significant difference is where these two stories happened. The feeding the 5,000 is in a Jewish region. The feeding of the 4,000 is in a Gentile region. Basically, she reminds him there's enough for everybody to feed everybody in her response about the pets and the children, right? And then he goes and proceeds to feed the other people that were not yet included, ballooning out from there. It's the beginning of, okay, yep, this is for all peoples. There's no one group that this is for exclusively.
I dig it. Well, that seems like a pretty good space to wrap up this conversation about Matthew 14 and 15. We are so thankful for everybody listening and watching for your company on this leg of the journey, and thank you to Elle Dowd for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really fun. It's good to be here with you all.
Yeah. The easiest way to support Found in Translation is to leave us a rating or review on whatever app or podcast player you are enjoying this on, especially YouTube and Apple Podcasts. All the other robots listen to those ones, so that helps more people find the show. You can find us on Facebook as Found in Translation. You can read the Liberation and Inclusion translation at www.litbible.net and follow its development on Threads as @lit.bible. You can follow Brandon Johnson on Blue Sky as @litbible.net, and you can follow me on Threads or Blue Sky as @BDRhodes. Elle Dowd, what's the best way for people to find you and keep up with what you're up to?
Yeah, you can always get in touch with me via my website at elledowd.com. I'm on Facebook at facebook.com/elledowdministry. And Elle Dowd Ministry is my TikTok handle too, although it's been a minute since I made a video, but I'm there. And then on Instagram and Threads, I'm How Now Brown Dowd. Yeah.
The music you're listening to is by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com. Found in Translation was produced on unceded Chinook and Kalapuya lands. Goodbye, Brandon.
Brandon.
Bye, Elle. Bye, everybody.
Bye.